The winter of 1066 had barely settled over Normandy when the messenger arrived, half frozen and mud-streaked from the Channel crossing. He was brought straight into William's hall, past the knights who had grown up with him through rebellion, siege, and betrayal. When he knelt and delivered the words, "Edward is dead. Harold Godwinson has taken the crown," the air in the room changed. William didn't hear it as a distant political shift. He heard it as a personal rupture. Edward the Confessor, his cousin, had promised him the throne. Harold had sworn an oath on sacred relics to support that claim. Now both promises lay shattered. In that moment, William understood that the balance of power in England had turned against him, and that his own honor and Normandy's security were at stake. William didn't rage. He didn't hesitate. He began to move with the same cold, deliberate resolve that had carried him through every crisis since childhood. William summoned his barons, the men who had fought beside him when he was still the bastard, a boy duke surrounded by enemies. They gathered in Rouen, in Caen, in the strongholds that had shaped the Norman identity. These were the families who would later spread across England and Scotland: the Desais, the de Mandevilles, the Fitzalans, the de Clares, the very houses whose bloodlines would eventually merge into my own. William laid out the case. Harold had broken a sacred oath, Edward's promise had been violated, and the throne of England, a throne tied to William by kinship and sworn agreement, had been seized unlawfully. His barons agreed. They pledged ships, men, horses, and loyalty. From there, the preparations began in earnest. Shipwrights along the Norman coast worked day and night, constructing the fleet that chroniclers later counted in the hundreds. Knights gathered their retinues. Priests carried word to Rome, where William sought and received the papal banner, a sign that his cause was not merely political but righteous. Across Normandy, the great families assembled under his call, forming the army that would carry their fortunes across the Channel. Many of these same families would later appear in Scotland, in Galloway, in Carrick. William wasn't just gathering soldiers, he was gathering ancestors of the medieval world. By the time the winds finally shifted in his favor, William had transformed a moment of betrayal into a movement of destiny. He stood at the head of a force bound by oath, ambition, and shared lineage, a force that believed it was crossing the sea not to conquer, but to restore what had been promised. And this is where my story truly begins, with a young duke who refused to accept the theft of his birthright, and with the network of families who followed him, shaping the kingdoms, clans, and migrations that would eventually converge in my own lineage. This is the spark that ignited everything that came after. Word of Harold's coronation spread through Normandy like a spark through dry timber. Within days, the great Norman houses began arriving in Rouen, the city Rollo had claimed generations earlier, the cradle of their identity. They came from Caen, from Bayeux, from the strongholds that lined the Seine. These were men who had fought beside William since his youth, men who had seen him survive assassination attempts, rebellions, and sieges. Now they stood before him again, not as scattered lords, but as a unified force bound by loyalty and ambition. William laid out the truth plainly. Harold had broken his oath, Edward's promise had been violated, and the throne of England, tied to William by blood and sworn agreement, had been seized unlawfully. The barons did not hesitate. They pledged ships, knights, horses, and the full weight of Norman power. Once the oaths were renewed, Normandy transformed into a war machine. Along the coast, shipwrights worked day and night, shaping the fleet that chroniclers later counted in the hundreds. Armorers hammered out mail and helm. Priests carried messages to Rome, where William sought the church's blessing and received it in the form of the papal banner that would fly over his army. Across the duchy, knights gathered their retinues, men who had grown up in the shadow of Rollo's legacy and believed they were crossing the sea not to conquer, but to restore rightful order. Many of these same families, the Desais, de Mandevilles, Fitzalans, de Clares, would later appear in Scotland, in Galloway, in Carrick, in the Fraser and Stuart lines. By late summer, everything was ready except the one thing William could not command, the wind. His fleet waited at Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, hundreds of ships drawn up along the shore, thousands of men camped in the fields behind them. Days passed, then weeks. The Channel winds held stubbornly against them as if testing William's resolve. But he did not waver. He prayed, he planned. He held his army together with the same iron steadiness that had carried him through every crisis of his life. And when the winds finally shifted suddenly, decisively, William gave the order. The fleet pushed off, oars biting into the water, sails snapping open in the night air. The invasion had begun. William crossed the Channel not as a gambler, but as a man convinced of his right. Behind him sailed the barons whose descendants would shape the medieval world, the very families whose DNA I've traced through surname clusters and triangulation. Ahead of him waited the throne he believed had been stolen, the battle that would define a kingdom, and the moment when Norman line would take root in England and generations later. When William's fleet finally reached the English coast, it was not chaos or confusion that greeted them, but opportunity. The winds had carried them south, and they made landfall at Pevensey, a natural harbor protected by marsh and shingle. The Normans moved quickly, securing the old Roman fort and establishing a defensive perimeter. Horses were unloaded, supplies organized, and scouts sent inland. William knew Harold was still in the north, recovering from the brutal fight at Stamford Bridge. That gave him precious time to build, time to prepare, time to force Harold to come to him. The Normans wasted none of it. They fortified Pevensey, then moved east to Hastings, establishing a second, stronger base on higher ground. This wasn't a raid, it was a calculated occupation. William was planting the first roots of Norman rule into English soil, and he did it with the precision of a man who believed he was restoring rightful order, not seizing a foreign crown. From Hastings, William began to move with deliberate pressure. His forces raided the surrounding countryside, not out of cruelty but strategy. He needed Harold to march south quickly before the English king could gather reinforcements. Every burned field, every seized storehouse, every disrupted village was a message. Come face me, or watch your kingdom unravel. And Harold did come. He marched his exhausted army south at a punishing pace, determined to confront William before the Normans could entrench themselves further. The two forces were now on a collision course, drawn toward the ridge that would become the battlefield of Hastings. On the eve of the confrontation, the two camps could not have been more different. The English, weary from weeks of marching and fighting, slept in tight ranks on the ridge of Senlac Hill. They were defending their homeland, their king, their way of life. Many of them were the descendants of those Anglo-Saxon kings, Ethelred, Edmund Ironside, Edward the Exile. Their line had ruled England for centuries. Below them, in the Norman camp, William prepared with the calm focus that had defined his entire life. His men were rested, disciplined, and organized. They were the descendants of Rollo, hardened by generations of warfare and bound to William by blood, by oath, and by ambition. They believed they were fighting for justice, for a promise made by Edward the Confessor, for an oath sworn by Harold, for the legitimacy of their duke. Two armies, two cultures, two branches of my own lineage, all converging on a single ridge. As dawn broke on October 14, 1066, the mist lifted to reveal the English shield wall stretching across the ridge, a solid line of wood and iron. Below them, the Norman cavalry formed up, flanked by archers and infantry. William rode along the front, steadying his men, reminding them of the cause that had brought them across the sea. This was not just a battle for a crown, it was a battle for the future of England. And for me, it is the moment where two great ancestral worlds collide: the Anglo-Saxon kings on the ridge, the Norman dukes in the valley. The stage is set, the armies are ready, the fate of a kingdom hangs in the balance. When the shield wall finally broke on Senlac Ridge and Harold fell, the battle ended, but the story didn't. What happened on that hillside was more than a military victory. It was the moment two royal bloodlines collided and fused, reshaping the future of Britain. The Anglo-Saxon world, the line of Athelred and Edmund Ironside, ancestors, gave way to the Norman world of William, the descendant of Rollo. One line lost the crown, the other claimed it, but both continued forward, intertwining through centuries of marriages, migrations, and alliances. From that single turning point, the threads of my lineage began their long journey north. Norman barons settled across England. Their descendants moved into Scotland. They married into the Gaelic houses of Galloway and Carrick. They joined with the Bruces, the Stuarts, the Frasers, the Anglo-Saxon royal blood that survived through St. Margaret and David. I met the Norman blood that crossed the Channel under William's banner. What began as a clash on a battlefield became, over generations, a merging of worlds, a merging that eventually shaped the very DNA many of us carry today. The Norman Conquest didn't erase the old world, it absorbed it, reshaped it, and carried it forward. Hastings was decided in a single day, but its legacy endured for 1,000 years, borne by the Norman who claimed the crown, the Anglo-Saxon kings who lost it, and the woman who, across centuries, braided their bloodlines into one through time.